Believing that the Germans in southern Russia were deeply demoralized after the destruction of the 6th Army at Stalingrad, STAVKA, the Soviet High Command ordered an aggressive advance against the German southern wing in the Ukraine. The Soviets planned to outflank the Germans in northeastern Ukraine and then turn south to cut the Nazi invaders off from the bridges over the Dnieper River. If everything went as planned, STAVKA believed it would achieve a grand encirclement of the German Army Group South operating in the Ukraine and cause a complete collapse of their southern wing. By early February, the Soviet 6th Army became exhausted after capturing the city of Kharkov, and it seemed the Germans were reeling. However, German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein unleashed his elite Panzer units in a devastating counterattack against the depleted Soviet forces. This Panzer Fury would also unleash the feared Tiger I tanks in a concentrated heavy tank battalion as the breakthrough tank they were designed for, with devastating results. In early February 1943, as the forces of the German 6th Army were laying down their arms in Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command STAVKA decided to launch a major offensive to push German troops back from the Don River toward the Dnieper River. The key objective of this operation, codenamed Zvezda, or the Star, was to recapture the city of Kharkov, the fourth largest city in the Soviet Union and a major industrial and communications center. The attack was spearheaded by the Voronezh Front, whose 3rd Tank Army crossed the Oskol River on February 2nd and began pushing west. However, despite the fact that the defeat at Stalingrad had influenced the morale of German soldiers, they showed strong resistance. When Soviet troops reached the North Donets River on February 5th, they encountered strong response from the troops of the German Army Group South. Particularly eager to prevent the Soviet tanks from crossing the river were SS Panzer divisions Das Reich and Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Panzer Grenadier Division Großdeutschland showed equally stiff resistance to the troops of the 69th Army. However, further north, once the Soviet 40th Army managed to capture Belgorod, they endangered the entire left flank of the German army. The victory put pressure on Germans, who were forced to retreat and open the way for Soviet advance on Kharkov. By February 14th, Soviet forces on the Voronezh Front were closing in on Kharkov from multiple directions. The 40th Army reached the city's northern outskirts, while the 3rd Tank Army and 69th Army attacked from the east and northeast. Despite fierce German resistance, Soviet troops entered the city on February 16th. Even though the German garrison showed remarkable resistance in the street fighting, by noon, the Soviets mastered the entire city. After Kharkov, the Soviets managed to maintain the momentum of their assault and exploit the success of Kharkov to advance further west to the city of Poltava. In days that followed, troops of the Voronezh and Southwest Front won more ground. The 6th Army and 1st Guards Army of the Southwest Front formed a huge salient south of Kharkov that split the forces of the German Army Group Kempf and the 1st Panzer Army. The STAVKA was assured that the Germans were in a state of chaos and they could not continue showing resistance for much further. It was a grave mistake made by the Soviet High Command. Even though they suffered a defeat at Kharkov, the Germans withdrew in good order. Not only were they ready to withhold the Red Army troops, but they were planning to deliver a devastating blow. The situation at the southernmost part of the Eastern Front caused grave concern to Hitler, who feared that a defeat in Ukraine might endanger all other army groups. He was so worried that he decided to pay a personal visit to the Army Group South headquarters and its commander, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. Manstein and his staff were located in the city of Zaporozhye on the Dnieper River, a bit more than 30 miles from the front line. The Fuhrer arrived on February 17th and spent the following day in their headquarters trying to find a solution to halt the Soviet advance. Hitler believed that the best way to strike back at the Soviets was to launch a direct assault on Kharkov and retake the city. However, Manstein, being one of the most brilliant German commanders, thought otherwise. He knew that he first needed to close the gap that occurred between the armies and eliminate the Soviet salient before he could attack Kharkov. The salient, he claimed, was the weakest Soviet spot in the entire front. In forming it, the Soviet 6th Army, 1st Guards Army, and the Army Group Popov overstretched their lines. In such condition, Manstein believed, they could be easy prey for German panzers. For that mission, Manstein decided to insert the 4th Panzer Army, freshly withdrawn from the Caucasus, north of the 1st Panzer Army. The brunt of the operation was to be carried out by this unit. The initial task for their commander, Colonel General Hermann Hoth, was to halt the Soviet 6th Army and the 1st Guards Army headed for the Dnieper crossings at Dnepropetrovsk and throw them back across the Samara River. To carry out this assignment, Hoth had at his disposal the 48th Panzer Corps, the 57th Panzer Corps, and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps with SS divisions Das Reich and the newly arrived Totenkopf. The 3rd SS Division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, was also kept to participate in the operations, but would remain under the command of the Army Group Kampf. During the operations, Hoth's left flank was to be protected by troops of the Großdeutschland Panzer Grenadier Division and 3 more infantry divisions. Their task was to hold the Soviet 3rd Tank Army and 40th Army engaged until the salient was eliminated. While Hoth and the 4th Panzer Army fought against the Soviets in front of Dnepropetrovsk, Colonel General Eberhard von Mackensen's 1st Panzer Army with 2 more Panzer Corps was to attack and destroy Mobile Group Popov east of them. After the Soviet armies in the salient were eliminated, German troops would move toward the Kharkov. The city itself would be attacked only in the 3rd, the final phase of the operation. The operation was to be supported by the 4th Luftwaffe from the air. For this task, Germans managed to gather around 160,000 men opposed by 210,000 Red Army soldiers. Despite the number disadvantage, Field Marshal Manstein was betting on his panzer troops. These battle-hardened divisions were mostly equipped with Panzer III and improved Panzer IV tanks, of which only the latter was capable of dealing with the Soviet T-34 medium tanks. Only the Das Reich and Großdeutschland divisions had a few Tiger I tanks, which were still relatively new on the Eastern Front at that time. These would prove to be effective in their original intended use as a primary breakthrough weapon for German spearheads. The entire operation was well thought out and relied on good intelligence reports. Yet it had one major problem. It completely opposed Hitler's idea on how to wage war. It took much persuading, but Manstein ultimately managed to convince the Führer that his plan was the best. And how right he was. The attack on the Soviet salient began on February 19th, while the Leibstandarte held a firm base around Krasnograd. Das Reich launched a rapid thrust across the south across the snowy plains to cut off the spearheads of the 6th Army and the 1st Guards Army. The attack of the SS Panzers was unexpected and even worse, too swift to respond to it. In just 3 days, Das Reich crossed 75 miles and entered the town of Pavlovgrad, thus encircling a large number of Soviet troops along the Dnieper River. In the following 2 days, February 22nd and 23rd, the division destroyed some of them and drove the rest north of the Samara River. On February 22nd, the Totenkopf joined Das Reich on the front, running a parallel course on their left flank. After the region between Samara and Dnieper was cleared, both divisions turned northwards and began their roll towards Kharkov. East of them, panzer divisions of the 48th Panzer Corps also pushed north. The Soviet front was collapsing throughout the entire salient. Overstretched and far from their supply depots, Soviet soldiers were unable to withhold powerful panzer thrusts. Simultaneously with the attack of the 4th Panzer Army troops, tanks of the 1st Panzer Army launched a wide pincer movement around the Soviet Mobile Pavlov group in the easternmost sector of the salient. By February 24th, the pocket had been closed and most of Popov's units trapped inside were decimated. Elated by the initial success of his counteroffensive against the Soviet southwestern front, Manstein on February 25th directed his 2 Panzer armies to strike north in preparation for an attack into the southern flank of the Voronezh front. In the following 2 days, these troops finished off the remnants of the Soviet forces that held the salient. Most Soviet tanks were immobilized due to lack of fuel, and as such, they posed no significant threat. Despite the fact that the German panzers were progressing above all expectations, Manstein urged his men to keep pushing. The melting snow was making roads soft and muddy, and he expected them to become completely impassable in a few days' time. Indeed, German tank commanders pushed their soldiers to the limits. On March 4th, troops of the 4th Panzer Army reached positions 10 miles from Kharkov. At the same time, the 1st Panzer Army established a strong foothold in their rear to prevent any incursion of the remaining troops of the Soviet Southwestern Front. Everything was set for Stage 2 of the operation. Practically on the doorstep of a city they lost 2 weeks earlier, the Germans had to decide now how to approach Kharkov. Manstein was a cautious military leader and didn't want to jeopardize the gains his men achieved so far. In order not to break away from Army Group Kempf and to create a gap in the front line, he decided to sweep around the city and attack it from the north and west. At this point, Soviet commanders from the STAVKA realized their mistake in underestimating the Germans. Not only had it cost them territory, but their entire right flank was now in danger. To minimize the damage already done, they sent reinforcements from the Varennes front to the Kharkov area to halt the German advance. The 3rd Tank Army was sent to defend the city while the 40th Army and the 69th Army were deployed north of Kharkov. On March 8th, 2 SS Panzer Corps broke away from the Marshal River on a broad front and moved toward their objectives. Das Reich was assigned to attack the city from the west, while Totenkopf and Liebstandart took the northern approach. The Großdeutschland Division also joined the offensive by running parallel with SS divisions toward the north, thus protecting their left flank. Manstein and Hoth's initial orders on March 8th were that the 2nd SS Panzer Corps was to stay out of the city. They should have taken Kharkov by a rapid stroke only if it was possible. For General Paul Hauser, commanding the SS Panzers, this was as if he received a direct order to assault. The SS divisions were eager to attack the city and avenge their humiliating defeat in February. Therefore, on March 9th at 17:30, Hauser issued orders for a surprise assault on the city to commence the next day. Das Reich was to come in from the west and the Liebstandart from the north, while Totenkopf was to form a protective screen to the north and northwest. On March 10th at 1900 hours, Manstein issued an order repeating the initial instruction to outflank Kharkov from the north, but left room for interpretation by adding, "If enemy resistance dwindles, Kharkov is to be taken." At 22:30, Hauser received another order, this time from Hoth, specifying that the attack on Kharkov should come from the east after the encirclement was complete. However, Hauser chose to disregard these orders and proceeded with his own plan of attack. By 0400 the next day, the Liebstandart Division, led by General Joseph Sepp Dietrich, launched 2 regimental groups in 4 assault columns, each taking a different road in the city. From the northwest, the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment split into 2 columns. The column marching toward the Severny railway yard encountered heavy resistance from Soviet troops positioned on the higher ground, but managed to seize the railway yard by the end of the day. The 2nd column, advancing through the suburb of Alexivka, had much more difficulties as they were pushed back by the T-34 counterattack. They managed to overcome the enemy only after receiving support from the artillery and Stuka bombers. In the end, these 2 columns secured a foothold in the city. The main thrust came from the north, down the Belgorod Road, with the 1st SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment and tanks from the 1st SS Panzer Regiment. They repelled a Soviet counterattack near the Kharkov airfield before entering the city at 0750. By afternoon, their fighting groups pushed into the northern suburbs. There, low on fuel, they dug in and set up a defensive perimeter. Meanwhile, on the western side of Kharkov, the Das Reich Division joined the assault. At 0800 hours, Heinz Harmel's reinforced SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment Deutschland advanced but was halted by a deep anti-tank ditch and heavy resistance by 1600. A Soviet counterattack from Rykov railway station was repelled in fierce fighting. Further south, SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment Der Führer cut the Marefa Road, securing a position south of the city. However, the assault of the Das Reich caused a fierce dispute between Hoth and Hauser. Hoth ordered Hauser to stop the western attack and move Das Reich north and east of Kharkov to cut the Soviet escape route out of the city. Hauser refused, arguing that pulling out under fire was too dangerous. He also pointed out that worsening roads and dense forests in the north would slow progress. Instead of withdrawing Das Reich, he decided to continue the assault and ordered the Totenkopf to send a force east and cover the escape route. Das Reich passed on. During the night of March 11th and 12th, its pioneers crossed the anti-tank ditch and surprised the Soviet defenders. By 0440, they had captured all enemy anti-tank guns and secured a bridgehead. By 0525, their tanks advanced toward the city. By noon, they neared the main railway station, their deepest point of advance. At 01:15, Hoth repeated his order for Das Reich to move east. Hauser delayed his response until 11:35, repeating his objections. At 11:50, Hoth, infuriated, issued a strict command to obey immediately. This time, Hauser complied. However, instead of taking the difficult northern route, Das Reich passed through Liebenstandart sector inside the city, allowing for a faster and smoother advance east. The Liebstandart made steady progress on March 12th. In the morning, its troops broke through field fortifications on the northwestern outskirts. Fighting against snipers and artillery fire, they reached the northern end of Kharkov's main railway station by 10:15, where they linked with the Das Reich. The main thrust group cleared the northern suburbs, fighting through apartment blocks. By nightfall, they were only 2 streets from Dzerzhinsky Square, the main square in Kharkov. The square was assaulted by the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Panzer Grenadier Regiment, which slipped through enemy lines and reached the edge of the square. With the support of tanks, one group moved through the city park and zoo toward the Shevchenko Memorial, while the other advanced along the main street. By evening, they reached the eastern end of the square and linked up with another fighting group. The conquered square was renamed Platz der Liebstandart. On the left flank, Kampfgruppe Meyer seized the key junction of the exit roads in eastern Kharkov. They formed a defensive position around the junction, repelling fierce Russian counterattacks throughout the day. On March 13th, the battle continued. Kampfgruppe Witt advanced from Dzerzhinsky Square toward the Kharkov River and the bridgehead secured by Kampfgruppe Piper. Progress was slow as Russian troops defended each blocks with machine guns and anti-tank weapons. Tanks hid in side streets and courtyards, while artillery kept the bridges under fire. By 12:30, Piper expanded the bridgehead, allowing a breakout along Moscow Avenue. At 1300, one of his columns linked up with Kampfgruppe Meyer at the Volchansk Junction, securing their position. The 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment used the same bridgehead to break into the southern sector of the city. At the same time, the only remaining Das Reich unit in the city, Panzer Grenadier Regiment Deutschland, cleared the southwest part of the city, meeting little resistance. By the evening, 2/3 of Kharkov was under German control. With Totenkopf and most of Das Reich fighting northeast of Kharkov, the task of capturing the rest of the city fell to Liebstandart. On March 14th, the division advanced east on a broad front. The 1st SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment cleared the northern sector, while the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment secured the south. Meyer's reconnaissance unit moved along the Chiguyev Road. Street fighting was intense, with house-to-house combat throughout the day. By late afternoon, the last residential areas were under German control. That afternoon, German radio announced that SS units with Luftwaffe's support had retaken Kharkov after days of fierce fighting. Yet the battle was not over. On March 14th, however, Liebstandart eliminated the last resistance in the factory district. Das Reich linked up with the 48th. Panzer Corps, which was advancing from the south while Totenkopf captured Chiguyev, sealing the Red Army's escape route across the Donets River. By that time, many Soviet troops had already escaped, but overall they suffered the destruction of 2.5 armies. It's estimated that the Soviets had more than 86,000 casualties, of which around 45,000 were killed or missing. On the other side, Germans had almost 8 times fewer casualties, around 11,000, of which 4,500 were killed or declared missing in action. The brunt of the fighting was borne by Hauser's 2nd SS Panzer Corps. During the battles, they lost 160 tanks while destroying between 600 and 1,000 Soviet tanks. The victory brought them significant publicity back home in Germany. The Führer was pleased too. He prepared a load of decorations for his brave soldiers of the SS division. However, none were awarded to the Corps commander, General Paul Hauser. Neither Hitler, Manstein, nor Hoth had forgotten his act of disobedience during the attack on Kharkov. But if Hauser had not acted as he did, bravely and without hesitation, the city of Kharkov might not have fallen into German hands. His actions gave the nation one last hope that the tide of the war on the Eastern Front could turn in their favor. However, this hope would last only until their next engagement at the Battle of Kursk. Thank you for watching this episode. If you liked it, don't forget to comment and subscribe to the Militology channel. Stay tuned.